Wow, nice. All right, we started talking last week about ecology, and I pointed out a bunch of stuff to you. Ecology's difference, just to review, uh, between organisms and their environment, the study of interactions between. Sorry, I was half paying attention to people who were ringing into the waiting room. The environment was all the factors surrounding and affecting an organism at any time. And remember, we said that environment and ecosystem had a lot in common, but were different and not exactly the same. So you need to pay attention to that. Ecology is not environmentalism. Environmentalism is activism. Environmentalism may rise as a response to what ecology learns, but a lot of environmentalism has a philosophical viewpoint in addition to the science. Ecology studies ecosystems. And then we talked about what ecosystems were. So, whoops, wrong button. So, ecosystem. An ecosystem, any more or less self contained um, area. Yes, any area that is more or less self contained with no outside influences. And there's always some outside influence, even if it's just the sunlight. So, if you took the whole Earth as an ecosystem, nothing comes into the Earth. It's all already here, right? Well, no. Sunlight comes in, and um, occasionally uh, chunks of rock from space fall in. And yes, they burn up in the atmosphere, but they don't cease to exist. They just vaporize, and the particles become potentially nutrient molecules. It depends on what substance it is. One day last week, um, you know, sometimes I wish I walked around with a running 24/7 camera. I was doing chores in the morning before light, and I looked to the south. Just happened to glance that way, and I saw what, from my angle, looked like a shooting star going straight down. Except it wasn't just this little streak. I don't even know how to describe it. It got bigger and bigger, and it ended up. I don't know how to describe how big it was. If a normal shooting star is a 1, this was probably a 10 in size of the fireball that I saw coming down. Anyway, my point is there are, even on the whole planet Earth, if you consider that an ecosystem, there are still outside influences. I will tell you, as far as the shooting star goes, I have two wild dreams that could happen but never will. One is to see to see a shooting star or meteor burn through the atmosphere and land and see where it lands and able to actually be able to grab it once it cools off enough you can touch. Okay, so that's weird, but I would think it would be so cool to have on my shelf a rock that I saw fall from outer space. The other really weird thing, by the way, is to find a mastodon skeleton, which is not as weird as it sounds. There have been 2 or 3 mastodons found within probably 50 miles of me. And I do have half of my property is very swampy. The kind of place where they find mastodons. Okay, it's a long shot, but still. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm just babbling now. So, any more or less self-contained area could be any size from planet to a bottle. Think of the bottle on my by the window in school. Living and non-living. Now, this is card 38. It actually fits here as far as the discussion goes, but it is at the end in the definition section. So it doesn't matter what number we call it. I put it here in the discussion because here's where it makes sense. So a watershed. You probably, if you halfway pay attention, have seen a sign that said something about watershed. So let's see, if you go down towards, if you have to go down to Ann Arbor range for something like few years ago now, probably, I don't know, 10 years ago now, when I shattered my wrist, I had to go down towards Ann Arbor for the hospital. And I kept seeing these signs, or the specialist, whatever. Chelsea is actually where I went, but that's, you have to go through Ann Arbor. On the way to Ann Arbor, you'd see these signs on the side of the road by rivers or streams or ditches that said Huron Watershed. And you may see them around Genesee County. They may say Flint River Watershed. I think I've seen Flint River Watershed. And I've seen a few of these signs that say this or that or the other thing watershed. So what in the world is a watershed, and what does it have to do with ecosystems? Well, at least in our part of the world, watersheds kind of make natural ways to delineate ecosystems. Because they're basically an area under the same influence. Watershed is all the area where the precipitation throughout the year runs into a specific body of water. So if you drive past this river or even a little creek and it says Flint River Watershed, that means that the water in that creek is going to run into the Flint River, the water from when it rains or the snow melts or whatever. And then the water from the Flint River runs into, I think, and I've never actually checked on this, but it seems like it should be Lake Huron. But when you get down into the southern part of eastern Michigan, the southeast corner of Michigan, the water there flows into Lake Erie. So flows into some river or whatever that flows into a specific body of water. So for example, here is what they call the Great Lakes Basin, which is the Great Lakes watershed. So we're, I don't know, somewhere right about here, I suppose. Annalise, someone's playing with your microphone. All right, we're right about there, let's say. So all of the rain that falls in this area of the state goes into this or that creek, which goes to this or that river, which goes into Lake Huron. And okay, this is a pretty much a who cares kind of thing, except for I do because I'm weird. Somewhere right around here is where my wife's parents live. And my father-in-law mentioned to me that he is right on or virtually on this line where everything that rains on this side goes to Lake Huron, and like within a quarter mile of him or less, everything that rains on this side goes into Lake Erie. I guess I can show you why, if anyone cares, I don't know, but if I change the sharing a little bit to share the active screen and then go to, let's say, the National Weather Service, and the National Weather Service has a topographical map on their radar. That's the thing here, you see. So if we look at the National Weather Service radar, if you look closely, you can see that there is this ridge that runs right along here. Right along here is a high spot. So my father-in-law lives, let's see, someplace right in this corner of the county. And so everything that rains on the one side of the ridge goes this way, and everything that rains up in Flint goes this way. And anyway, that's, now let me check and see. I think you should be seeing what I'm, yeah, looks like you're good. Looks like you're seeing the National Weather Service map, I hope. So each of these is a watershed. Each of these basins, they're called basins because they're a little bit lower in the center and higher on the edge. That is why that's why the water flows into the lake, because they're lower in the center and higher out here on the edge. This one feeds Lake Michigan. The green one up here feeds Lake Superior. This going up into Ontario and Quebec goes into the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is not a lake, but that's where Lake Ontario goes on its way out to the ocean. So the moral of the story is, this would be a natural ecosystem because this is an area where there is very little outside influence. Whatever precipitation happens here affects all the way into the lake, but whatever precipitation here does not affect the yellow area. So that's a watershed. In this case, we're referring to them as basin. That's kind of an almost synonym, but not every watershed would be a basin. But that would make a natural way to delineate an ecosystem. Or we could just as well say the whole Great Lakes region is an ecosystem. So the term ecosystem is not exactly cut and dried. It's a little bit flexible depending on what you want to study and what you have to study with. All right, well, whatever. So we talked about the abiotic portion of ecosystems, all of the non-living factors, weather, nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, sulfur, soil, fire, atmosphere, light. And now we want to take some time and talk about and this is where we pick up, well, I guess the watershed card was new, but as far as the sequence of the notes, this is where we pick up the next point with the biotic portion of ecosystems. Now, I had meant And then I forgot to give myself a blank page in here to do some writing on. I'm going to draw some really terrible pictures here. My famous or infamous or no one ever noticed, who knows, stick figure of everything. All right, so the biotic part of the ecosystem. Biotic, remember, bio refers to the living portion. And by the way, part of the living portion used to be alive, it's not anymore. So the biotic factors are all of the living factors, all of the living factors in an ecosystem. They include, this card's going to be chock full, producers. Producers are, okay, it's kind of hard to say that there isn't a part of an ecosystem that's not important. Everything in an ecosystem is important because you take one thing out and you throw the balance. But it would be easy to make an argument that producers were one of the top most important things in an ecosystem, because producers, what do they produce? They produce food from non-food, if you will. So, you know, cows produce food, meat, milk, whatever, but cows produce food by eating other food, grass or hay or grain or whatever. Plants produce food from non-food, from light energy. So producers are the living things that convert inorganic would be non-living energy like sunlight, see, usually light, into organic energy, which in the case of plants, it usually starts out as glucose. Remember, we did photosynthesis. Plants take carbon dioxide and water, and they use it to produce glucose and oxygen. So glucose is like the first step of food from plants, and the plants make it from light. If plants, for whatever reason, okay, this is purely hypothetical, I don't know any way this could possibly happen, but if plants all died out suddenly, things would start running out of food and dying out up the food chain, not too far behind. So they're very, very important. Now, by the way, in case anyone cares, and this is not something you have to know, when we say usually light, well, what else is it? There are a few organisms that can use chemical energy like sulfide gases that are emitted from the earth deep in the ocean and can use those to produce food energy. But they are not particularly common. Okay, so basically, if you don't make energy, then you have to eat energy. So consumers are living things that eat other living things. So you're a consumer, the cow is a consumer, a bee is a consumer. Basically, everything that isn't a plant is a consumer. But different things eat different, what do I want to say, different ways, different kinds of diets. Primary, the symbol for primary is 1 degree. Primary consumers eat producers. So, and this card's coming up shortly. Primary consumers are what we usually call herbivores. However, it's not always cut and dried. So, for example, peanuts. The company, the the grain company that I buy my cow feed from gets, I don't know, 20 or 30 pound, 40-pound boxes of peanuts in the fall, and still in the shell. And I buy a box of peanuts and put them a few at a time on the counter, and that's what I snack on quite often. So like this morning, I set out 20 peanuts. I can have 20 peanuts for my stack today. So I'm being a primary consumer. I'm eating plant products. I'm eating peanuts are a kind of not nut, they're a kind of pea because it's, like beans and peas. They are a pea that is like a nut. So they're from plants. And when I eat the peanuts, I'm being a primary consumer. But there's a package of hamburger thawing in the refrigerator, and sometime soon my wife is going to make hamburgers. We're going to have hamburgers, and then I will be not a primary consumer because I won't be eating plants. I'll be eating cows. So this is not a cut and dried, you're one or the other. Some things go back and forth. In fact, we would all consider dogs to be carnivores, meat eaters, but Copper, if you remember Copper, just insists, now that the fresh grass is growing, every time she goes outside, she insists on eating a little grass. And people will give you any number of reasons why dogs eat grass, but there's crossover. It's okay. This will surprise you. Deer, white-tailed deer. Everyone in the world says white-tailed deer are herbivores, primary consumers. But you know what? Now that we've got all these trail cams out, keeping track of deer all over the country all the time, you know what we're finding out? Strangest thing. Disturbing, actually. White-tailed deer like to nibble on baby birds, and if they can find a baby hatchling in the nest, they like to eat the baby birds. So I don't know. It's not cut and dried. It's not cut and dried on the primary consumer. I mean, you don't have to be all primary or all secondary. Speaking of which, there it is, secondary. Secondary, and the symbol for secondary is 2°. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. So when I sit down and eat my peanuts, I'm acting like a primary consumer. And then when I sit down and eat the hamburger, I'm acting like a secondary consumer. By the way, side note, meat processing plants, if you haven't noticed in the news, are having to shut down around the country because of their employees getting sick, or just walking out because they're afraid they'll get sick. And farmers are starting to have to kill their chickens and some of their cows. And pig farmers are afraid they're going to have to just kill their pigs because they can't sell them, because they can't butcher them. So meat prices are probably going to go through the roof in another month, give or take. Anyway, sorry. Got a lot of side notes today, don't I? So let's see. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, like the cow out grazing on the grass is being a secondary consumer. Me eating the peanuts is being a secondary consumer. If you had a salad for lunch today, you were a secondary consumer, unless you had bacon on it, and then you were. No, I'm saying this wrong. I'm sorry. Cows are primary consumers. They eat grass. When I eat the peanuts, I'm a primary consumer. If you had salad, you were a primary consumer, unless you had bacon on it, not bacon bits, that's fake bacon. That's probably plant-based, but if you had actually bacon chunks on it, then you were being a secondary consumer. When you eat the cow, you're a secondary consumer. When you eat the bacon, you're a secondary consumer, maybe even a tertiary consumer. Huh? Tertiary? There it is, tertiary. Or 3rd degree. They eat secondary consumers. So, and yeah, this starts to get really mixed up. it's a lot easier to list it than it is to keep track of it in any given organism. Because, so let's say that your chicken's running around. Some of you had chickens. And let's say you let your chicken run around and the chicken runs through the yard eating grass, primary consumer, and insects, secondary consumer, and maybe even chickens can be vicious. Maybe even the chicken, if you have two or three of them especially, manages to corner a mouse and peck it to pieces and eat the mouse. Normally, when I shoot a deer, when I'm all done butchering it, I put the skeleton in the chicken coop, and the chickens pick all of the meat off the bones. So sometimes the chicken actually can act like a secondary consumer or a tertiary consumer, a third level consumer. So it's not always cut and dry. There's some kind of back and forth here. And when we discuss it, we're going to kind of oversimplify it and act as if it were cut and dried and everything was clearly a 1, a 2, or a 3. And they can go even higher than 3. The 4th level would be a quaternary consumer. The 5th level would be, I don't know, 5 degree. I've never really, it'd probably be a pentary consumer, but they almost never get to 5, and especially past 5. And there's a really good reason. You cannot keep going forever. Primaries consumers are eaten by secondary consumers, are eaten by tertiary consumers, are eaten by 4th level quaternary consumers, which occasionally maybe are eaten by 5th level, but there's never ever a 6th level, and there's a reason for that, and I'll explain it to you when we're finished with this, because you should know that whatever level it is, 3rd or 4th or 5th, a keystone species, I think somewhere, last unit, I think I told you guys a little bit about keystone species. Keystone species are very important in an ecosystem. A keystone species is the top level consumer in an ecosystem, whatever that top level might be. Some of you are just like brain dead, probably waiting for me to quit yapping. Some of you maybe are actually thinking, and well, what is the top? The 4th or the 5th? It varies. Some food chains only go to the 3rd level. Some go to the 4th level. Whatever the top level is in a particular ecosystem, the predator at that top level is the keystone species. It's a keystone because it keeps the herbivores and so on in check, keeps them from overpopulating. There's not many, for example, there's not many deer predators left in Michigan. The wolves are pretty rare and only mostly in the upper part of the Lower Peninsula. I'm just thinking Lower Peninsula now. There's wolves in the Upper Peninsula. And, you know, occasionally you hear about a mountain lion or a puma or whatever you want to call them, but no one's ever really sure. The top level, the humans are, well, cars, humans are the top level predator for deer in lower Michigan right now. And so if not enough people hunt, the deer get overpopulated and they start to cause problems. And actually, the problems they cause are with farm crops. But if all of a sudden the farm crops went away, they would eat the grass and so on out, and they would start up, and they would start starving to death. So actually, humans are the keystone species for white-tailed deer, at least in this part of Lower Michigan. Now, one other group, and this group doesn't really fit into consumers, so we just give it its own group. I mean, they are consumers, but where do they fit? Primary, secondary, tertiary. It's hard to fit them as one of those levels, so we call them decomposers or detritivores. And they don't really eat a plant or an animal. These are things that break down the remaining dead organic material. So maybe you go fishing. Maybe you have worms and you go fishing. And you jab your hook into the worm and this poops out stuff that looks like black dirt. Well, what that actually is, are you ready? Black dirt. Worms just go along eating the dirt, and whatever little pieces of dead anything are left in the dirt, they digest, and whatever they can't digest, they poop out the other end, and they change little scraps of dead leaves and dead plants and dead animals and dead whatever into humus, black dirt. Now, let's see. Some terms. Notice we're at card 39. You know what? This is a good place. I see we're at 31 minutes. This is a nice, convenient place to stop. So we'll stop right here. Don't forget you have a quiz today. You should expect a quiz every day pretty much. And get that done by 3. We'll stop here. You have a good afternoon. We'll talk to you tomorrow.